Hello, this is Criminal Behaviorology. I'm your host for Criminal Behaviorology, Timothy Joseph. You might be asking, what is criminal behaviorology? Well, we try and get the word out. I've tried to I have a few social media sites. I got a Facebook site, a blogger site. Got here on Podomatic, where I have been doing the podcasts. It is the combined forces of the fields of criminology and behavior analysis, and that can take many different forms, very many different manifestations. We've covered a few topics here on the podcast. We're going to reach out and have more information. I'm going to visit a few more conferences. I'm going to visit a substance abuse conference for the Association for Behavior Analysis International's got a conference on substance abuse, first of its kind that I know of, in Washington, D.C. in November. I had a poster up for criminal behaviorology at the last ABAI annual conference that took place in San Diego back in May. So it is something that perhaps isn't widely talked about, but there's been some literature on it. Tonight I've looked forward to doing this. I haven't had an opportunity to cover some of the more well-known criminal cases, but I'd had an interest in doing this for some time, but I'm glad I waited until now because I came across a very important documentary film, and the case I wanted to talk about was the Kitty Genovese case that took place in New York City in the 1960s. And for those of you that have had any interest in psychology or any of the social sciences or some on criminal history, you will be familiar with the Kitty Genovese case. It is well talked about, and dare I say, it is legendary because I covered this case we reviewed this case in a social psychology class. In fact, several psychology courses covered the Kitty Genovese case, and it has to do with the diffusion of responsibility. And I'm going to go over some more details about it for those that aren't familiar, but it is a young woman that was tragically murdered, and the idea being that there were these alleged witnesses that didn't do anything to help her. They just allowed her to be murdered. But this documentary film and some other evidence that has come out really debunked this whole idea. There's something that I'd listened to carefully and believed every word of. And it just goes to show the importance of not just getting data, but getting accurate data. So I'm gonna actually, in this case, to make it simple, I'm gonna go right to the Wikipedia article on it, and it's going to give us some background information on the Kitty Genovese case. All right, here it is in Wikipedia. Murder of Kitty Genovese. In the early hours of March 13th, 1964, Kitty Genovese was stabbed to death outside her apartment building in Kew Gardens, K-E-W Gardens, a neighborhood in the New York City borough of Queens. New York City's, I lived there in late 1990s. New York City, as you know, is a big place. It's got 5 boroughs. They're like city sections of it. They could be independent cities themselves. Queens is physically the largest of them. Okay, 2 weeks later, the New York Times published an article claiming that 38 witnesses saw or heard the attack, but none of them called the police or came to her aid. The incident prompted inquiries into what became known as the Bystander Effect, or Genovese syndrome, that's in quotes, and the murder became a staple of American psychology textbooks for the next 4 decades. However, researchers have since uncovered major inaccuracies in the New York Times article. The Wikipedia page is going to give us some updates on the Kitty Genovese case, but I'm going to talk a little bit about why something like this would become inaccurate, an inaccurate reporting of it, because I don't think that as we study here, behavior has an origin to it. It has a function. There's something going on when a story like this gets so widely believed and it's so different from the reality of it. But there's a movie called Witness that was made by Kitty Genovese's brother. It's a very interesting documentary film that updates the case brilliantly. But I'll pick up where the Wikipedia article left off. Reporters at competing news organizations discovered in 1964 that the article. Reporters at a competing New York news organization discovered in 1964 that the article was inconsistent with the facts, but they were unwilling at the time to challenge New York Times editor Abe Rosenthal. In 2007, an article in The American Psychologist found, quote, no evidence for the presence of 38 witnesses, or that witnesses observed the murder, or that witnesses remained inactive. In 2016, the New York Times called its own reporting, quote, flawed, unquote, stating that the original story grossly exaggerated the number of witnesses and what they had perceived. I had not heard about this, and maybe some of you out here in the study of crime and psychology, maybe some of you have heard this. Maybe they've updating this information in college psychology courses that I'm sure are still talking about this case. I don't know, but to me it was a surprise. They talk about her murderer, Winston Mosley, a 29-year-old Manhattan native, was arrested during a house burglary 6 days after the murder. While in custody, he confessed to killing Genovese. At his trial, Mosley was found guilty of murder and sentenced to death. The sentence was later reduced to life imprisonment. Mosley died in prison on March 28, 2016, at the age of 81, having served 52 years. We're going to talk a little bit more about him in just a little bit. Catherine Susan Kitty Genovese, born July 7, 1935, was born in Brooklyn, New York City, the eldest of 5 children of Italian-American parents. She was raised Catholic, living in a brownstone home at 29 St. John's Place in Park Slope. I've been to Park Slope, a western Brooklyn neighborhood populated mainly by families of Italian and Irish heritage. In her teenage years, she attended the all-girl Prospect Heights High School, where she was recalled as being self-assured beyond her years and having a sunny disposition. After her mother witnessed a murder, her family moved to New Canaan, Connecticut in 1954, while Genovese, who had recently graduated from high school, remained in Brooklyn with her grandparents to prepare for her upcoming marriage. Later that year, the couple wed, but their marriage was annulled near the end of 1954. It didn't last long. After moving into an apartment in Brooklyn, Genovese worked in clerical jobs, which she found unappealing. By the late 1950s, she had accepted a job as a bartender at the time of her murder. She was working at a bar manager at Eve's, it's got EV, 11th Hour Bar on Jamaica Avenue and 193rd Street in Hollis, Queens. She shared her Kew Gardens apartment on Austin Street with her girlfriend, Mary Ann Zielonko, Zieleonko, whom she met in 1963. The night she was attacked at approximately 2:30 a.m. on March 13th, 1964, Genovese left the bar where she worked and began driving home in her red Fiat. Incidentally, on this Wikipedia page, they have a very famous picture of Kitty Genovese, a very famous close-up picture. It's a mugshot, and she was arrested on a gambling charge, but that wasn't clear that that's what that was every time I'd seen that picture, but that's a mugshot. While waiting for a traffic light to change on Hoover Avenue, she was spotted by Winston Mosley, who was sitting in his parked car. Genovese arrived home around 3:15 a.m. and parked her car in the Kew Gardens Long Island Railroad Station parking lot about 100 feet from her apartment's door in an alleyway at the rear of the building. As she walked toward the apartment complex, Mosley, who had followed her home, exited his vehicle, which he had parked at a corner bus stop on Austin Street. Armed with a hunting knife, he approached Genovese. Genovese ran toward the front of the building, and Mosley ran after her, overtook her, and stabbed her twice in the back. Genovese screamed, "Oh my God, he stabbed me! Help me!" Several neighbors heard her cry, but only a few of them recognized the sound as a cry for help. When Robert Moser, one of the neighbors, shouted at the attacker, "Let that girl alone," Mosley ran away, and Genovese slowly made her way towards the rear entrance of the building, seriously injured and out of view of any witnesses. Witnesses saw Mosley enter his car, drive away, and return 10 minutes later. Shadowing his face with a wide-brimmed hat, he systematically searched the parking lot, the train station, and the apartment complex, eventually finding Genovese, who was barely conscious and lying in a hallway at the back of the building where a locked door had prevented her from going inside. Out of view of the street and of those who may have heard or seen any sign of the initial attack, Mosley stabbed Genovese several more times before raping her, stealing $49 from her, and running away again. The attack spanned approximately half an hour, and knife wounds in Genovese's hands suggested she had attempted to defend herself from him. A neighbor, Sophia Farrar, found her shortly after and held Genovese in her arms. This is according to the Wikipedia article. Records from the earliest calls to police are unclear and were not given a high priority. One witness said his father called the police after the initial attack and reported that a woman was beat up but got up and was staggering around. A few minutes after the final attack, another witness, Carl Ross, called the police, who arrived at the scene within minutes of his call. Genovese was picked up by ambulance at 4:15 a.m. and died en route to the hospital. She was buried in Lakeview Cemetery in New Canaan, in Connecticut. The Kitty Genovese story spawned a lot of interest, and a lot of television and movie ideas were spawned from this idea of the so-called bystander effect. Law and Order had an episode on it. In the original movie Death Wish with Charles Bronson, there's a scene where he hears screaming and then closes the blinds as if, we don't want to get involved. And there's been another movie made about it, and there's a popular idea that people are just going to let someone get murdered and not do anything about it because they just want to be bystanders. So this was widely believed. As I said, it's been in some of my college classes. It's probably been in some of yours if you've studied a similar field. Most everybody's heard about this case that has any interest in crime and history. So I came across the documentary Witness, and I'm gonna play a little bit of the. I'm going to play a little bit of the trailer for you.
Exactly what was it you heard?
Save me, save me.
Didn't this frighten you or shock you?
No.
I was 16 when my sister Kitty was murdered in New York City. For years, I avoided the details of that night, but it's worse not knowing the truth. The Times story was seen as proof that New York City was uncaring, and my sister's been the symbol of bystander apathy for decades.
No one investigated the 38? No one followed up on it or anything of that nature?
Was it worth all the attention it got, or was it a media creation?
It's a fascinating story. And undoubtedly sold newspapers.
I heard somebody saying, help, help. I called the police.
You called the police?
Always.
The story doesn't make any sense to me. I'm sick of listening to people tell you 38 people stood by and watched. That's not so.
It really doesn't take a lot to kill a person, I guess.
Maybe we could start it off by talking about what it is you're trying to accomplish by having a meeting with Winston Mosley.
The choices that he made in his life were all related to the fact that no one helped his sister. And if he knows the truth, that's a peacefulness.
At what point are you going to be satisfied? 50 years later, we're still talking about Kitty.
I can't stop until I feel like it's over.
Yeah,
like
when is it over?
I'll know when it's over.
Okay, and that is the title of that documentary film, once again, is The Witness from 2016. The witness follows the efforts of her brother Bill as he looks to uncover the truth buried beneath the story. In the process, he makes astonishing discoveries about the crime that transformed his life, condemned a city, and defined an era. Got some bells and whistles going off in here. Okay, so I'm going to say a little bit about actually I'm going to say a lot about the man that killed Kitty Genovese, and why hasn't he been talked about more frequently? He's a very interesting character, but we talked about some theory about how other people acted when the crime occurred, how other people failed to act, and the person that did it has kind of gotten lost on all this. But his name is Winston Mosley, born March 2nd, 1935. He died at the age of 81, March 28th, 2016, in Clinton Correctional Facility in New York. He was 29 years old at the time he murdered Genovese. He was from Ozone Park, Queens, where he was apprehended by police during a burglary on March 19, 1964, 6 days after the stabbing. At the time of his arrest, Mosley was working as a Remington Rand tab operator, had no prior criminal record, and was married with 3 children. While in custody, Mosley confessed to killing Genovese. He detailed the attack, corroborating the physical evidence at the scene. He said that his motive for the attack was simply to kill a woman, saying he preferred to kill women because they were easier and didn't fight back. He stated that he got up that night around 2 a.m., leaving his wife asleep at home, and drove through Queens to find a victim. He saw Genovese in her home and followed her to the parking lot before killing her. He also confessed to murdering and sexually assaulting 2 other women and to committing between 30 and 40 burglaries. It says here in Wikipedia, subsequent psychiatric examination suggested that Mosley was a necrophile. Look that one up if you're not familiar with it. In the trial, Mosley trial began June 28th, 1964, as provided over the Judge Erwin Shapiro. The defendant initially, he had a not guilty plea, but his attorney later changed the plea to not guilty by reason of insanity. During his testimony, Mosley described the events on the night he murdered Genovese along with 2 other murders in which he confessed to numerous other burglaries and rapes. The jury deliberated for 7 hours before returning a guilty verdict. On June 15th, Mosley was sentenced to death for the murder of Genovese. When the jury foreman read the sentence, Mosley showed no emotion while some spectators applauded and cheered. Judge Shapiro added, "I don't believe in capital punishment, but when I see a monster like this, I wouldn't hesitate to pull the switch myself." On June 1st, 1967, the New York Court of Appeals found that Mosley should have been able to argue that he was medically insane at the sentencing hearing when the trial court found that he had been legally sane and the sentence was reduced to lifetime imprisonment. That's how they decided to handle that. March 18, 1968, Mosley escaped from prison while being transported back from Mayer Memorial Hospital in Buffalo, New York, where he had undergone minor surgery for a self-inflicted injury. He hit the transporting correctional officer, stole his weapon, and fled to a nearby vacant house owned by a Grand Island, New York couple, Mr. and Mrs. Matthew Kaluga, where he stayed undetected for 3 days. On March 21st, the Kalugas went to check on the house when they encountered Mosley, who held them hostage for more than an hour, binding and gagging Matthew and raping his wife. He then took the couple's car and fled. Mosley traveled to Grand Island, where on March 22nd he broke into another house and held a woman and her daughter hostage for 2 hours before releasing them unharmed. He surrendered to police shortly afterward and was charged, I remember to shut all the bells and whistles off. He was charged with escape and kidnapping, to which he pleaded guilty. Mosley was given 2 additional 15-year sentences to run concurrently with his life sentence. He's not done yet. During the 1970s, Mosley participated in the Attica prison riot, and late in the decade obtained a Bachelor of Arts in Sociology in prison from Niagara University. He became eligible for parole in 1984. During his first parole hearing, get this, he told the parole board that the notoriety he faced due to his crimes made him a victim, saying, quote, this is Mosley's statement, "For a victim outside, it's a one-time or 1 hour or 1 minute affair. But for the person who's caught, it's forever." That's what he said. At the same hearing, Mosley claimed he never intended to kill Genovese and that he considered her murder to be a mugging because, quote, "people do kill people when they mug them sometimes." The board, understandably, denied his request for parole. He returned for a parole hearing in 2008. On March 13th, the 44th anniversary of Genovese's murder, he continued to show little remorse for Genovese's murder, and parole was again denied. Genovese's brother Vincent was unaware of the 2008 hearing until he was contacted back by New York Daily News reporters. Vincent Genovese had reportedly never recovered from the horror of his sister's murder. He said, quote, "This brings back what happened to her. The whole family remembers." Mosley was denied parole an 18th time on November 2015. He died in prison in 2016 at the age of 81. He had served 52 years, making him one of the longest-serving inmates in the New York State prison system. This guy was a real fiend. He was really, he should be a well-known case. I mean, of this kind of a crime spree. But I knew nothing about him. When it's taught in school and the writings of it, they say almost nothing about the perpetrator. Very interesting individual. a section here on psychological research. In an article in Psychology Today, in his book, the author of who'd written about Rosenthal, had written about this case, asked a series of behavioral scientists to explain why people do or do not help a victim, and sadly he found none could offer an evidence-based answer. How ironic that this same question was answered separately by a non-scientist. When the killer was apprehended, the chief of detectives, Albert Seidman, asked him how he dared to attack a woman in front of so many witnesses. The psychopath, referring to Mosley, calmly replied, "I knew they wouldn't do anything people never do." The apparent lack of reaction by numerous neighbors purported to have watched the scene or to have heard Genovese's cries for help, although erroneously reported, prompted research into diffusion of responsibility and the bystander effect. Social psychologists John M. Darley and Bib Latinier started this line of research showing that, contrary to common expectations, larger numbers of bystanders decrease the likelihood that someone will step forward and help a victim. The reasons include the fact that onlookers see that others are not helping either, that onlookers believe that others will know better how to help, and that onlookers will feel uncertain about helping while others are watching. Genovese's case thus became a classic feature of social psychology textbooks in the United States and the United Kingdom. In September 2007, the American psychologist published an examination of the factual basis of the coverage of the Genovese murder in psychology textbooks. It's been a while ago. 2007. The three authors concluded that the story was more parable than fact, largely because of inaccurate newspaper coverage at the time of the incident. According to the authors, despite this absence of evidence, the story continues to inhabit our introductory social psychology textbooks and thus the minds of future social psychologists. A survey of 10 leading undergraduate psychology textbooks found the Genovese case in all 10 of them, with 8 textbooks suggesting that witnesses watched from their windows as Genovese was murdered, and 2 textbooks stating that some or most of the witnesses heard but could not see the attack. One interpretation of the parable is that the drama and ease of teaching the exaggerated story will make it easier for professors to capture student attention and interest. And that is a real danger with these kind of stories. It's the people won't let the facts get in the way of a good story. So it really prompts people to tell this kind of legend to make a point. I think there probably is something to the bystander effect, but the accuracy of the Genovese case was not looked into. It was not verified. There were no 38 people watching a murder and not doing anything. Much of the crime was not visible, and furthermore, people did try and call the police. Psychologist Francis Cherry has suggested the interpretation of the murder as an issue of bystander intervention is incomplete. She pointed out additional research such as that of Borowski and Shotland demonstrating that people, especially at the time, were unlikely to intervene if they believed a man was attacking his wife or girlfriend. She has suggested the issue might be better understood in terms of male-female power relations. I've heard that interpretation before, which is another reason the Genovese case has become so popular. It's a good example for feminist ideology or concerned with the rights of women, or the concern of rights of people that are subject to victimization. So it's become a good talking point. And it may be for legitimate causes, maybe legitimate reasons, but the story itself was not accurate. Accuracy of the original reports. More recent investigations have questioned the original version of the events. A 2004 article by New York Times by Jim Rasenberger, published on the 40th anniversary of the Genovese murder, raised numerous questions about the claims in the original Times article. A 2007 study found many of the purported facts about the murder to be unfounded, stating there was no evidence for the presence of 38 witnesses or that witnesses observed their murder, or that witnesses remained inactive. After Mosley's death in 2016, New York Times called the secondary story flawed, stating, "Well, there was no question that the attack occurred and that some neighbors ignored cries for help. The portrayal of 38 witnesses as fully aware and unresponsive was erroneous. Exaggerated the number of witnesses and what they had perceived. None saw the attack in its entirety. Only a few had glimpsed parts of it or recognized the cries for help. Many thought they had heard lovers or drunks quarreling. There were 2 attacks, not 3, and afterward 2 people did call the police. A 70-year-old woman ventured out and cradled the dying victim in her arms until they arrived. Miss Genovese died on the way to the hospital." Keep in mind also that there was no 911 system at that time. You had to get on, look in the phone book, and get patched through to your local police precinct. This was quite a while ago. So it's not like you just dial 911 and get somebody on your cell phone like you can now. The article, Wikipedia goes on, because of the layout of the complex and the fact the attacks took place in different locations, no witnesses saw the entire sequence of events. That's all the way I always envisioned it when it was taught to me. I thought they were standing at their window and just saw the whole thing happen. Investigation by police and prosecutors showed that approximately a dozen individuals had heard or seen portions of the attack, but none saw or none was aware of the entire incident. A documentary featuring Kitty's brother William discovered that other crime reporters knew of many problems with the story, even in 1964. Immediately after the story broke, WNBC police reporter Danny Meehan discovered many inconsistencies in the original article in the New York Times. Meehan asked the New York Times reporter Martin Gansberg why his article failed to reveal that witnesses did not feel that a murder was happening. Gansberg replied, "It would have ruined the story." Not wishing to jeopardize his career by attacking a powerful New York Times editor, Abe Rosenthal, Meehan kept his findings secret and passed his notes to fellow reporter Gabe Pressman. Later, Pressman taught a journalism course in which some of his students recalled Rosenthal and confronted him with the evidence. Rosenthal was irate that his editorial decisions were being questioned by journalism students and angrily berated Pressman in a phone call. On October 12, 2016, the New York Times appended the editor's note to the online version of its 1964 article, stating that later reporting by the Times and others has called into question significant events of this account. The story of the witnesses who did nothing is taught in every introductory to psychology textbook in the United States and Britain, and in many other countries has been made popularly known through television programs and books and songs. And we list a lot. Oh, there's so many programs and writings by serious people, some of them covered in this, that they list in this Wikipedia article. This is a lesson for us all, that we there is a function of this behavior, and we're not talking about the behavior of people standing by doing nothing. That would probably be due to a punishing effect, or just a lack of incentive to do something. But probably this idea that somebody doesn't want to get involved. There's a punishing effect of stepping forward, especially if you feel if somebody else is going to do it. I don't doubt that. But the behavior I'm referring to is people accepting unverified data, because there's numerous reasons why they might want to push the story. They have a narrative. possibly, I'm thinking they don't want to talk about the kind of violent crime that was going on in New York, so they'd rather talk about the negligence of the regular people. And the idea being, well, if you people weren't so negligent, we wouldn't have as much violence going on. But whatever there's a narrative to it. There's an incentive to look at things a certain way, and it was well received. So a lot of these criminal cases that you hear on the news today, we need to look at that with a grain of salt. We need to question it. You need data to really look at problems and solve problems, but it's got to be accurate. It's got to have some fidelity to it. It's got to be verified, and it should be open to being questioned. This particular story was it was tragic that it happened. The film Witness is really heartbreaking to see. It's a well done documentary. There's a scene in there where Kitty Genovese's brother, who kind of had a difficult life of his own, he confronts. He has a meeting with Winston Mosley's son, and that just shocked me. You got to watch that scene. That's really. I couldn't. I'll let you look it up and watch it. It's the movie Witness, but I was just taken aback by that. Mosley himself was really a psychopathic personality. If we accept the concept of a personality, he's certainly very crime-prone and not accepting of responsibility ever. Shocking story. I recommend finding it, looking it up, The Witness. And when you get information on particular criminal cases, go ahead and look at it with interest, but also keep in mind that even the regular newspapers, even sociology and psychology textbooks, are not necessarily giving you accurate information. That will be the lesson, I think, from the Kitty Genovese case. At least for us, this has been Criminal Behaviorology. Until next time, I'm your host, Timothy Joseph. Have a great weekend. I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.